Welcome to this edition of Blogging Heads. My name is Gregory Gause. I teach Middle East politics and international relations at the University of Vermont.
And I am Shadi Hamid. Hi, Greg. How are you, by the way?
Hi,
Good
Shadi.
to see you again on Blogging Heads. I'm looking forward to this.
Nice to see you.
So, my name is Shadi Hamid. I'm the Director of Research at the Brookings Doha Center and a Fellow at the Brookings Institution. My research focuses on democratic reform in the Arab world and the role of Islamist movements.
So Shadi, of course, has been very busy because there's been a lot of democratic reform and a lot of Islamist movements in the last few months.
Yes, that's right.
Shadi and I have had a number of these sessions in which we've differed civilly but intensely on what American policy should be toward what many are calling the Arab Spring, but I can't find any single Middle East expert who likes the term, but we'll shorthand it for the Arab Spring. Shadi, you were a proponent of the military intervention by NATO and other countries, including Qatar and the UAE, in the civil conflict, civil war in Libya. How do you think it's turned out?
Well, I think it's turned out fairly well, with some reservations perhaps, but I believe more than ever that it was the right thing to do. We prevented a massacre in Benghazi, but more importantly, now Libyans have a chance to rebuild their country and to move towards democracy. And I have been encouraged by the performance of the National Transitional Council they've done a lot in 6 months. They've been able to unify various factions, draft a constitutional charter, self-govern in Benghazi, and of course now they have taken over Tripoli and are getting ready to set up their government. So I think all of that bodes well, that Libyans finally have a chance to do what they want and to make their own decisions as a country. But for me, the bigger takeaways in terms of what this really means for U.S. policy and for us in the international community is, first of all, it confirms the role of external actors, that sometimes the internal pressures aren't enough. And sometimes you need to have countries like the U.S. and Europe come in and tip the balance one way or the other. So that's one lesson for me. But and also, I think this is one of the few times where the U.S. has aligned itself with Arab democratic aspirations, and Libya is one of the only places in the world where people are actually waving American flags and saying, "Go Obama." It's the only place in the world where people are slaughtering sheep in the name of Sarkozy. Sarkozy is probably more popular in Libya than he is in France.
Although that wouldn't take much from what I understand in France.
Right. But so, that to me, those are good things. And it shows that if the U.S. does the right thing, that it can create goodwill in the Arab world, something it hasn't been able to do in the rest of the region. So,
you think it's a net positive?
I have to be honest. Maybe Obama has made me into a neocon of some sort and all of that. I don't know, but I don't really understand the other argument. I know, Greg, we've talked about this before, but I think in retrospect, I just have trouble understanding the argument that we shouldn't have done anything. And maybe it's because I'm coming more from a moral, emotional standpoint, but I think the responsibility to protect is an important norm. And Libya was the closest thing we had to what I would call a pure intervention. Our vital interests were not at stake. And I know that critics of the war would say that's why we shouldn't have intervened.
Yeah.
But for me, it's the opposite. That means it was a better intervention because we did something for the right reasons, the right thing for the right reasons. And, I think pure interventions are good because there aren't these ulterior motives necessarily. It isn't just about national interests. We're doing it because we believe in the responsibility to protect civilians.
Yeah, and I take a very different take on this. I mean, I was against the use of military force in Libya for the very reasons that you set out. I couldn't see an American national interest here. And thus I didn't see that it was worth spending our treasure and potentially our blood on this. I think a lot of people who were on my side in this intervention did make arguments that don't now hold up, because if you're making a practical argument against it, i.e., this isn't going to work, then obviously it did work. It worked in that the rebels in Benghazi were protected, and then eventually the Gaddafi regime was overthrown. So you can't make an argument about efficiency on this. But to me, if you're going to make arguments about efficiency for getting in, which you didn't do, you made a moral argument, and I'll get to that in a second. But if you're going to make arguments for efficiency going in, i.e., this will be easy, or at least it won't be hard, or all the stars and planets are aligned right for us on this, then I think that you're on very weak ground, because we just can't know, right? Those kinds of arguments were made in Iraq in 2003 by some smart people. They were wrong. But I think that we have to do, while any military intervention, you have to take the practicalities on the ground in effect, right? And certainly Libya was more practical than, say, Syria would be. God forbid that we do anything like we did in Libya and Syria, from my perspective. But I have a bigger problem with this, because while it might have started and been justified by responsibility to protect, it became regime change very, very quickly. And I think that to the extent that this sets a precedent, it just reinforces notions in the American political system, both from the neocons and from liberal interventionists like you, that responsibility to protect is in essence a cover for regime change. Now, I think that the United States should be out of the business of regime change in the Middle East, both on practical grounds. I don't think that it serves our interest, and I don't think that, frankly, the Middle East, and here I probably differ from quite a few people in the post 9/11 atmosphere, I just don't think the Middle East is that important to American interests. Things about the Middle East might be, a cutoff of oil, take the extreme scenario, some cutoff of oil in the Persian Gulf. Yeah, maybe, but rebellions in Libya, not so much. And thus, I see this case as strengthening the hand of people who want us to be more involved in the Middle East, when I think that we've been too involved in the Middle East, certainly over the past 10 years, and should be trying to get less involved, particularly in trying to direct the domestic politics of these countries. Let me go. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, so it strengthens the hand of people like me then.
Yes, exactly. You win, I lose, as usual, Shadi, when you and I talk. But I think that if one assumes that American interests are intensely involved in the domestic politics of the Middle East, and this was one of the 9/11 consequences, right, where I think across the American political spectrum, it was generally agreed, and I think incorrectly, but generally agreed, that the main reason 9/11 happened is because of the dysfunctions of domestic politics within the Arab world, within the larger Middle East. Throw in Pakistan, throw in Afghanistan, throw in Iran. And thus, what the United States has to do for its security is be intensely involved in the domestic politics of these states. I had another take on why 9/11 happened. I think it happened more or less because of small group dynamics and a number of big historical processes, right, that go back to the Afghan jihad, that go back to politics in Saudi Arabia, that go back to all sorts of things, right? But that the domestic element of this, the dysfunctions of authoritarian governance, had been around in the Middle East for ages, for decades. And to me, it was a mistake to focus in on that element of it as the policy reaction to 9/11.
Okay, let me push back on a couple points here. You raised some really important ones, I think. So, I think you mentioned Iraq. I think Libya was fundamentally different because all the elements were there. You had Arab League support. You had Libyans themselves begging for us to intervene and saying, where is the U.S. on this? You had even the GCC supporting a no-fly zone. Yeah. You had UN legitimacy. You had Arab popular sentiment more or less in favor of supporting the rebels. So I guess my question is, if you're not going to support a humanitarian intervention in those circumstances, when will you ever? I mean, it was a perfect storm of various components coming together. So if you're against the Libya intervention, I suspect that would mean you're generally against humanitarian interventions writ large.
I'm generally against it, but I think that we have to recognize, and I think you would recognize this, tell me if you wouldn't, that Libya shifted very, very quickly from a humanitarian intervention, which one I think could argue in the first week or so when the Gaddafi forces were menacing Benghazi. It shifted from a humanitarian intervention to a regime change strategy.
You're right, and to be honest, I don't particularly have a problem with that, and I don't see what's so bad about intervening in a civil war as long as you're intervening on the right side, and I think we were. The UN resolution, as you know, also authorized all necessary measures to protect civilians. And from my standpoint, civilians would have never been safe as long as Gaddafi was in power. So from my kind of broader interpretation of the resolution, I think regime change wasn't necessarily the kind of violation of the spirit of the resolution that some people think it was.
Well, certainly you would not, the Russians and the Chinese would not agree with you, right? There is certainly no international consensus. And you mentioned international legitimacy as being an important element in these kinds of interventions. There's certainly no international consensus on turning R2P into regime change, right? The Russians feel like they got snookered on this, as far as I can tell, and thus are dragging their feet on the Syria side because they say we're not signing on to this again. I think one of the problems for your side on this, Shadi, is for folks like me, it looks like you guys did a bait and switch, and we got involved in a civil conflict, right? That beyond after the responsibility to protect element was basically accomplished, we got involved in a civil war, and you said that's okay. We picked the right side. I'm not confident that the United States can pick the right side. I'm not confident that I know what the right side is. I'll grant you on this one, not hard. Gaddafi was a bad actor. But let's step back and ask ourselves from the point of view of Gaddafi's international behavior, not his domestic behavior. Not such a bad actor in the last 10 years, right? This is a guy who gave up his WMD, which we wanted him to do. This is a guy who cooperated with the United States post 9/11 counterterrorism strategy, including, cooperating on renditions and all that kind of thing that we're finding, good evidence about now. This is a guy who reopened his energy sector to Western energy companies. And so you got Total, you got BP, you got ConocoPhillips, you got ENI in there. This is a guy who, I'm sure wherever he is now, on the Niger border or wherever he is, he wakes up and he says to himself, I did everything they wanted me to. Why are they doing this to me? And I wonder what effect that might have down the line in dealing with other recalcitrant governments. I think about an Iran that is having an internal debate, I think, about where to go with its nuclear program. And I can imagine those who are in favor of moving toward weaponization in Iran saying, we can't negotiate with these guys. Look what they did in Libya. Libya gave them everything they wanted, and they still went after them. And so I worry a little bit, I worry more than a little bit about those knock-on consequences to the Libya policy.
That's totally fair, and I'll be the first to admit that there are disadvantages, there were costs. There's no perfect course of action. So even when I was advocating for military involvement in Libya, I was careful to acknowledge that it's not going to be the easiest thing. It's not going to be straightforward. So there is always the risk that once we get into these things, we're going to lose control over the situation. So I do acknowledge that. In terms of going from protection of civilians to regime change, I don't think it was a bait and switch on the part of people like me and others who supported this course of action, like Mark Lynch or Juan Cole. At least speaking for myself, I believed in regime change as the ultimate goal. And the UN couldn't have said that because they wouldn't have been able to get China and Russia on board. So they had to do whatever was necessary to get the resolution to pass. I mean, that's the way politics works. And it was very important at that point to get a UN resolution. And I think the spirit of the resolution and saying specifically the words all necessary measures to me left the opening for taking it to the next step. So other people can call that mission creep, maybe, but what were we going to do? Intervene in Benghazi, stop the massacre, then say our work here is done and let Gaddafi continue terrorizing his own people and leaving the rebels to have a stump state on one side of the country? That would have been a disaster for Libya, the region, and U.S. interests. And I think now, and this goes, yes, I have a moral argument, but I think I also have a political argument based on American interests. Maybe they're not the most vital American interests, but now I think the goodwill of Arabs matters. Yeah, I know foreign policy is not a popularity contest, but as we're seeing in Egypt now, if people don't like America and they live in a democracy, then the government is going to have to be responsive to that. So we can't always assume that governments are going to be insulated from public domestic opinion in the Arab world.
I agree with you 100%
precisely.
on that.
So the fact that Egyptians are angry affects U.S. interests. The fact that Libyans kind of like us now affects us in a positive way. So
let me make a point on that, though. I agree 100% that one of the consequences of the regime transitions in the Arab world, where we will be getting some greater degree of democracy in many of these places, whether it will be stable, whether it will be perfect, who knows. Yeah. But is that foreign policy is going to be more affected by domestic public opinion. And I think that Egypt is, the perfect case of that. My problem with highlighting public opinion as a major element of what America should be doing there is that public opinion, and I don't mean this in just in the Middle East, I mean public opinion everywhere, is incredibly fickle. I mean, that the day Mubarak stepped down, if you took a poll in Tahrir Square, anyway, I don't know about the rest of Egypt, if you took a poll in Tahrir Square, America would have been fairly popular. People might have said you were late to the party, but at least you came along, right? And now, for a number of reasons that we understand about American policy in the region and perhaps perceptions of the United States not being fully with the democratic transition, which I think are inaccurate, but that's okay. The public opinion profile of the United States in Egypt is more negative. I think it's a fool's errand to chase after public opinion on these short-term things. I mean, my guess is that we'll do something. We, the United States, will do something down the road, 2 years from now, that will make public opinion in Libya kind of mad at us. And so I think that it's a mistake for American foreign policy to ignore public opinion. You're absolutely right about that. The more democratic the Arab world gets, the more public opinion will affect foreign policy, and that's important. But it's equally, I think, a mistake to think that the United States can fine-tune public opinion in the Arab world in a way that will benefit American foreign policy.
Yeah, that's certainly true. But I think that what we can at least strive for is aligning the U.S. with with long-term trends in the region, with Arab democratic aspirations, so Arabs can look and say, who was with us in our time of need when we were fighting and dying for our freedom? And presumably they'll say, oh, Russia and China? Not really. The U.S. and Europe, they were at the end of the day on our side. And I worry that we're not going to hear that because, to be frank, we haven't been on the side fully or in any kind of consistent way in a number of these countries. So what I'm saying is, let's take a longer-term perspective and let's stop undermining the aspirations of the people we say we want to help in the Arab world. And that's why anti-American sentiment in Egypt is no surprise, because history didn't start 8 months ago when Mubarak stepped down. History was the last 30 years where we were seen as accomplices in supporting Mubarak's repressive regime. It's going to take time to undo that. But I think now is the right time to start to enter into this reorientation of U.S. policy because, and I think there are going to be serious costs. And as these countries become more democratic, they start opposing U.S. interests. We're already seeing that now. It's hurting us. It's hurting our influence. It's hurting our standing. And I actually don't want China to eclipse the U.S. in the Middle East. I think it's a positive.
We're agreed on that one.
Okay, great, good.
But I think actually that the long-term perspective you're talking about is one in which public opinion will be less important. And I'll tell you why. Because I think that if we get consolidated democracies in the Arab world, I think there will be some issues on which public opinion will push these governments to take positions the United States won't like consistently, and that's on Arab-Israeli issues. And that's just, unless we're going to take a more serious stance on getting a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian problem, that's just something we're going to have to live with, unfortunately. I'd like to see us do more there, but I'm a pessimist about the possibilities. I assume you are too, because any rational person would be if they looked at the situation. But here's the deal. Once these countries consolidate, and if they do, then they're going to pursue foreign policies based not just on public opinion, but on senses of geopolitical interest, and that shifts, right? I mean, think about the American Revolution, right? France helped us in our revolution, and almost immediately, we took a neutral position in the French-British conflict. We fought against Britain in our revolution. The French were an integral part of helping us. And yet, when France and Britain started fighting, we were neutral. I think that the foreign policies of these countries will be directed by, perceptions of interest that will be affected by public opinion, but not controlled by public opinion. And in that sense, it seems to me that balance of power politics, economic interests, and all the things that factor into foreign policy are going to be equally important in a democratic Arab world. Without a doubt, public opinion is going to be important too, but it's not going to be the driver. And the longer away we get from this year of upheaval, this year of revolt, maybe of revolution, when we look back on it, we'll say it was a year of revolution. The less important those kinds of emotional feelings about who was with us and who was against us are going to be.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I hope you're right. I don't know if you consider Turkey to be a consolidated democracy, or at least getting there.
Compared to its neighbors, yes.
Well, I think we've seen there how public opinion still seems to matter a lot. The AK Party seems to be very much in tune with their own public sentiment, which is still largely anti-American. They're obviously also appealing
I want to stop you there because I actually think that what you see in Turkey is, yes, public opinion affects the AK party's foreign policy, and I think that the use of the Israel issue by Erdogan is both about domestic public opinion and regional public opinion to consolidate its position. But what did Turkey do the same week that it withdrew its ambassador from Tel Aviv and kicked the Israeli ambassador out of Ankara? It agreed to put in NATO early warning systems.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. So it's not just public opinion that's driving it. There's a strategic vision here, and I think that's what we'll see in the Arab world.
Yeah. Well, let me kind of bring up another point on this. When we're talking about the benefits of the U.S. having a pro-democracy posture in the region, and this kind of gets us into the bigger issue of leading from behind, which I think is a somewhat accurate way to describe Obama's foreign policy approach. And I think, anyway, but, looking longer term and also our competition with China and other rising actors, I really feel that the U.S. is able to distinguish itself through its ideals, through its commitment to things like democracy, because ultimately we have a degree of soft power the Chinese are probably never going to have. I mean, people still do look to the U.S. for inspiration, and it's no mistake that the Libyan rebels in their time of need, they didn't say, where are the Chinese? Why aren't they sending their airplanes over? They said, where is the U.S.? Where is Britain? Where is France? I think there's still this kind of, many people, even the ones who are anti-American, and it's part of this weird love-hate relationship that a lot of Arabs have towards the U.S. and the West. It's almost as if they want us to succeed. They want the U.S. to be better, to live up to our better angels. And I feel that down the road, America can stay a superpower, assuming that's what you want to call it, if it's able to set itself apart and say, we aren't like every other nation state that cares only about its vital national security interests. We aspire to something greater because we do care about spreading prosperity and freedom across the world. I know that's a very kind of, that's the way a lot of Americans look at American policy now, and I'm not saying that's the way it has been, but I think that if we aspire to that, that is going to put us in good stead 20 or 30 years down the road when China will be closer to economic parity with us, and we're going to say, well, okay, the economic parity is there, but what makes us different? Why should the rest of the world or Arab countries ally themselves with us?
I'm just profoundly cynical about that kind of rhetoric. I mean, I think that every imperial power since Genghis Khan, and I'll exempt the great Khan from this, believed that it was helping the people it was imperializing, and I think in the end most people got pretty cynical about the benefits that the imperial power brought. But more troubling to me is that this kind of rhetoric, which I understand. You believe it extremely sincerely, and I'm not questioning your motives here. But I think a lot of people who use that rhetoric use it to try to get us involved in things that we have no business being involved in. And I think that even the most sincere people who advocate this, and I would include, frankly, the last President Bush 43, I think was absolutely sincere when he talked about bringing freedom to Iraq. I think he really believed that that's what he was doing. I think that it leads us into adventures that can drain the American blood and treasure. And I think Iraq is just case one here. I mean, you and I have this argument that we didn't invent, right? This is the classic argument between kind of Wilsonian interventionism in American foreign policy and the more capital R realist balance of power, classic interest-based politics. And so it's going to be a tension in American politics for some time. I think in the post 9/11 world, we veered too much toward the Wilsonian interventionism, and one of the problems that leads to is the dilution of American power in marginal ventures. You said you don't want China to be the dominant power in the Middle East. Neither do I. But it seems to me that the spending down of American resources to maintain in trying to direct the domestic politics of Arab states is something that's going to drain American power a lot faster, and thus give the Chinese more of a power advantage that they will then exploit using classical balance of power politics. Now, once they get involved in the Middle East, they're going to have problems too, because the Middle East is a thicket of problems, not because people there are different from other people, but because of the structure of the Middle Eastern system. It's a multipolar system. Balance of power politics are incredibly important, and you add in the ideological issues like Arab-Israeli issues, like transborder identities, be it Arabism or Islam, that complicate politics. And you can understand why the Chinese are reluctant to get involved in the Middle East and are happy right now to free ride on American power there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, but Greg, I'm not arguing that the U.S. should direct the domestic politics of the Arab world. In fact, I've been very adamant about the precise opposite, that we should not be favoring one party or the other, that if Egyptians want to vote for Islamist parties who don't like America, they have the right to do so, and we have to respect democratic outcomes. So my position is, let's help support democracy and partnership with Arab people, but once they establish that and they have free mechanisms to choose their own leaders, we don't mess around with that, because then it gets disastrous when we're picking sides. That's not America's job. But I think, to be fair, democracy is not value neutral, but I think democracy at least is something that people all across the Arab political spectrum all agree they want. What they disagree about is what happens after democracy. So I think we should have a role in the former, but not the latter.
Right. I agree with you 100% that the United States has no business intervening in the domestic politics of democratic Arab states. If Egypt wants to elect an Islamist parliament, fine. I mean, that's what Egyptians should do if that's what they want to do it, and we'll deal with it. I think we should recognize that will lead to serious problems in the U.S.-Egyptian relationship. But from my perspective, we can handle that. I agree with you that we shouldn't be trying to play politics in these new democracies. I think that, but we do have interests that they have to know, right? I mean, an Islamist parliament in Egypt that takes that nibbles away at the peace treaty, doesn't even abrogate the peace treaty with Israel, but nibbles away at it. It's going to be extremely difficult for the United States to cooperate more fully with that kind of Egyptian government, and I think that will be clear, and we'll have a shaky ride with this, but we can live with it. I agree with you 100%. We shouldn't be intervening in these newly democratic political systems to try to tilt the table one way or another. But I take it further. I don't want to intervene to promote democracy either. If democracy comes in these places, I say that's fine. We can live with it. We're the most powerful country in the world. We can live with it, even though democratic politics in the Arab world, certainly in the short term, will lead to governments that take foreign policy stances that the United States won't like. That's fine. On the other hand, I'm not, and this is where we get back to Libya, I would not advocate American intervention to push democracy either. I'd argue for a much more cautious policy.
So you wouldn't advocate American intervention or American military intervention?
Certainly not military intervention. I would be very cautious about other kinds of intervention too.
Okay, and I'm curious too, I mean, what about the moral component? And we've talked a little bit about how we perceive the long-term interests, and obviously I see an important moral component to this. But how much do you think that should play in the calculations of U.S. policymakers? I mean, presumably, for better or worse, many Americans, including myself, would like to see Arabs enjoy the same freedoms that we do, because we believe it's something universal, and it affects us emotionally. I think most Americans, when they were watching the images from Tahrir Square, they felt an emotional kinship with Egyptians. They're like, wow, I mean, we did that too, 250 years ago. So, what do you feel about that? I mean, should that move us? And if it does move us, how can we separate that from the way we view policymaking?
Right. Basically, no, I don't think it should move us. I'm a horrible person, as you've probably already discovered. But here's if you want my moral stance on this.
Yeah.
I think that there's a moral value to non-intervention. And non-intervention, when you're a powerful country like the United States, can lead to, terrible things can happen that if you intervene, you might be able to correct. But intervention also means that you are, putting your weight on one side. As you said in Libya, it's almost inevitable. The notion of a clean responsibility to protect bleeds so easily into picking a side. It's almost inevitable that you have to pick a side. And that's what bugs me, because I don't think that we have the moral foresight to pick the right people on a consistent basis.
Well, what if we did, theoretically?
I would still be incredibly nervous about these kinds of interventions, just because in the end, I think foreign policy, I think you have to limit your foreign policy goals because we don't have endless resources and we don't have the political will and capacity to sustain a policy of long-term intervention in numerous places in the world. Because if we take your point, it seems to me this is not limited to the Middle East, right? We should be doing this. We should be doing this in a lot of places.
Like where?
Well, I think that there are probably areas. I'm out of my league now because the only thing I know about is the Middle East.
Same here.
That and American sports are the only two things that I claim any expertise on. But I can imagine situations in Burma. I can imagine situations. Right. I can imagine situations in Tibet. Right. That would, if we followed purely the moral imperative that you lay out, we would be in a conflict with China because the people of Tibet, who might tomorrow or the next day or the next year rise up against Chinese control, non-democratic, anti-democratic control of their country, and might call upon us to help them. And the last thing I want to do is be in a war with China.
I think that's interesting. I think a big difference there is I think that the U.S. has some responsibility for how the Middle East has evolved over the last couple decades, that we played a role in undermining democratic movements and supporting autocratic regimes. So I almost feel like we're part of the problem. So it's not as, I think with Tibetans don't hate us because we've been, sanctioning their repression. I don't think that's really the dynamic there. The Arab world, I think, is a unique case because of how long we've been intertwined, and to be frank, the negative role we've played in many of these countries. So it's almost as if, and maybe this isn't a good idea for foreign policy, but I think there's almost an aspect of redemption here, and I think this maybe also explains Sarkozy's approach in Libya, that he's almost doing penance for past sins.
I always thought redemption was personal, not national. But I just don't see the Arab world as unique in this respect. I mean, you can make the very same argument about Latin America, and it seems to me that the United States supported authoritarianism in Latin America right up to the when the Cold War was no longer relevant. I want to say the end of the Cold War, but the 80s, when the Soviet Union and the left was not as it were, a challenge to an ideological challenge to American dominance in Latin America. So yeah, I think we just differ on this one. I don't see the Middle East as that unique from an American perspective. I don't think we've committed unique sins there, for which we have a unique responsibility for redemption.
That's fair. That's fair. I think that's an area where it's more of an ideological disagreement.
Right.
And but one final thing before we try to close up is and kind of removing the moral component now. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on this.
I'm on steadier ground when we remove the moral component.
Right. So this back to this idea of leading from behind. Right. I'm curious, as a scholar of international relations, what you view the implications of Obama's approach here. That do you think that this is leading to a power vacuum, that if the U.S. leads from behind, others aren't necessarily going to jump in? And I think that was one of the disappointments for me in the Libya case. I ultimately supported the decision to intervene, but I was very critical of the way we did it, that we were very hesitant and half-hearted and wishy-washy. Right. We wanted to intervene, but we didn't put our full resources behind us. We were waiting for France and Britain to kind of take the lead. And I talked about this a bit in a recent Atlantic article that I wrote on the lessons of the Libyan intervention. But one of the points I made here is that, we imperiled potentially the operation. I mean, assuming that we were in and we wanted it to be a success. I think going about it in such a half-hearted way was not the smartest thing strategically in terms of getting to the end point. So I'm curious. I mean, what is this leading from behind thing? Is it sustainable?
right? I'll set aside the whole question of whether I thought we should be in or not. Tactically, once we're in. I guess I was more sympathetic with leading from behind because I mean, I see a long-term American problem with declining resources. And I think that for a while, Europeans, for more than a while, our European allies have free road. We need an English professor on this one.
Either
acted as free riders on American security. And it seems to me that if the French and the British were all hepped up about Libya, then it made some sense for the United States to stay in the back and not commit as many of its resources. Now, that does endanger the mission. There's no question about that because the French and the British don't have the same military capabilities the United States had, and obviously couldn't have taken the lead in the operation without United States logistics and support, right? That was clear. But it seems to me that this notion of leading from behind is the way a resource-strapped great power has to act to sustain itself, right? In the wake of the biggest financial crisis since the Great Depression, in the wake of some upheaval in American politics, right? That calls into question the whole notion of where American foreign policy is going. I think we're going to have a very interesting election in 2012 in which foreign policy isn't going to be talked about much, but could have enormous foreign policy consequences for the United States. That the only practical way to lead on things that you don't consider to be of intense, vital national interest is to lead from behind to encourage other players to commit more of their resources. If we lead from the front, nobody commits anything. It seems.
Well, what if leading from behind doesn't lead to the intended outcome? What if it doesn't result in Britain and France and the EU countries beefing up their security and defense capability? And it's a very open question as to whether or not it will.
Then the mission is a failure unless you want to escalate, and that's the risk that you take. But I think the risk on the front end is by assuring individual mission success by leading from the front, you pretty much guarantee that anybody else who's in the game with you is in only symbolically.
Right. Okay. So where does that leave us?
I think it leaves us leading from the front rarely, leading from behind much more often, risking failure, but husbanding our resources. And that to me is...
Right, in terms of resource constraints, I mean, the Libya operation didn't cost that much for us at the end of the day, so I don't really fully understand that the resource argument here. This stuff doesn't have to be incredibly expensive.
But we can't know that. We can't know that ex ante, right? And that's my problem. That's why, circling back to the start, and this probably would be a good place to finish, because when you circle back to the start, you've probably gone in circles too much. But I started by saying that my argument, the realist side's argument against Libya, that was based purely on a probability of success, isn't a very strong argument because we were successful in getting rid of this regime. But it's impossible to know ex ante how many resources you're going to spend to accomplish your mission. And I know Iraq is not your favorite example for me to bring up, but all the planning on Iraq was that we were going to be out in 6 months, and boy, it didn't happen that way.
On that optimistic note.
Great as always talking to you, Shadi. Someday you and I are going to have to actually meet in person and talk about this stuff.
Oh, that's hard to believe we haven't actually done that. I feel like I know you quite well now after
all
of our debates on blogging heads.
It's absolutely true. So the next time you're in Burlington, Vermont, or the next time I'm in Qatar, we're definitely getting together.
Sounds like a plan. Okay,
all
Greg.
Right. Bye-bye, Shadi.
Bye.
See you.
Bye.